The northern shore. Long before the word Viking became a symbol of raiding, there were quiet farms beside cold northern waters. Families in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden lived between forests, fields, islands, and fjords. They knew the sea as a road rather than a boundary. By the late 8th century, some of these people began sailing farther from home, first as traders and explorers, then sometimes as raiders. Their journeys would connect places that had rarely met so directly before. Tonight, we can follow those journeys slowly, from the sheltered coasts of Scandinavia to Britain, Ireland, France, the rivers of the East, Iceland, Greenland, and finally the edge of North America. A land shaped by water. Scandinavia did not produce one single Viking people. It contained many local communities, rulers, dialects, customs, and rivalries. Geography mattered. Denmark offered flatter farmland and easy access to the North Sea and Baltic. Norway stretched along a broken coast of deep fjords and steep mountains. Sweden opened toward the Baltic and the river routes beyond it. In all three regions, boats were practical tools of ordinary life. They carried fish, timber, livestock, iron, people, and news. A person who learned to travel by water could reach neighboring settlements more easily than by crossing difficult land. That simple fact helped make northern seafaring a normal skill long before famous raids began. Most people were farmers. The image of every Norseman as a warrior is misleading. Most people spent much of their lives farming, fishing, repairing buildings, making cloth, caring for animals, and preparing for winter. A household could include relatives, workers, dependents, and enslaved people. Wealth came from land, livestock, useful objects, and social connections. Seasonal work shaped the year. Spring meant planting and repairs. Summer offered the best time for travel. Autumn brought harvest and storage. Winter brought long hours indoors, where tools were mended and stories were told. Raiding was one activity within a much larger society. Understanding that ordinary world makes the later voyages easier to explain, because the sailors always came from communities rooted firmly on land. Why sail away? No single cause created the Viking Age. Population growth may have mattered in some places, but it was not a simple story of overcrowding. Political competition encouraged ambitious men to seek wealth and followers. Growing trade created knowledge of distant ports and valuable goods. Improvements in ships made longer journeys practical. Silver circulating through Europe and the Islamic world gave raiders and merchants something portable to pursue. Inheritance customs and local rivalries could also push individuals abroad. Some people left for one season and returned. Others settled permanently. The same ship might carry traders on one voyage and armed men on another. The Viking Age grew from many choices made by many communities, rather than from one great migration planned in advance. The longship. The most important tool of expansion was the Scandinavian ship. Builders shaped overlapping wooden planks into a light, flexible hull, strengthened it with ribs, and combined sail with oars. A long, shallow vessel could cross open sea, move quickly along a coast, and enter rivers that larger ships could not use. Because it did not need a deep harbor, a crew could land on beaches or riverbanks. The square sail saved human effort on long passages, while oars gave control when winds failed or precision mattered. Different ships served different purposes. Some carried cargo, some people, and some were designed for speed. Their design turned northern waterways into connected routes and gave Norse travelers remarkable freedom of movement. Finding a way across the sea. Viking sailors had no magnetic compass in the modern sense, yet they were not traveling blindly. Experience taught them to read coastlines, winds, waves, birds, clouds, and the changing position of the sun. Familiar routes could be remembered through landmarks and sailing directions passed between crews. Open sea crossings demanded judgment, especially in fog or bad weather. The voyage from Norway to the North Atlantic Islands could be divided into stages, reducing the time spent far from land. Sailors also understood currents and seasonal conditions. Their navigation was practical knowledge built through repetition. It did not remove danger, but it allowed ships to move reliably enough that routes became traditions, and traditions eventually became networks linking distant shores. Lindisfarne, 793. In the year 793, raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. The event became famous because Christian writers recorded it with alarm. Lindisfarne was an important religious community, associated with learning and pilgrimage, so violence there carried symbolic weight far beyond the material loss. The attackers probably saw something different. A coastal religious house could contain valuable metalwork, supplies, and people, while being less heavily defended than a fortified town. The raid was not the first contact between Scandinavia and Britain, and it was not the first act of northern violence. Yet its memory became a convenient marker for the beginning of the Viking Age in Western Europe. Why monasteries were tempting targets. Monasteries often stood near coasts or rivers because those locations connected them to travel and trade. They could store food, silver objects, books with decorated fittings, and gifts from wealthy patrons. Their purpose was religious, not military, so walls and trained defenders were not always priorities. For a small raiding crew, this combination could be attractive. A ship might arrive quickly, take portable wealth, and leave before a local force gathered. This did not mean every monastery was helpless or that every Viking voyage targeted churches. Over time, communities adapted. Treasures were hidden, defenses improved, and warning systems developed. The first surprise was difficult to repeat forever. Raiding changed the behavior of both the attackers and the societies they visited. The shock in the written record. Most surviving written descriptions of early Viking attacks were produced by people who feared them. Monks and clerics wrote of destruction, punishment, and uncertainty. Their words are valuable, but they also reflect the viewpoint of communities under threat. The raiders themselves left far fewer written accounts of these journeys. Archaeology, therefore, helps balance the story. Coins, weapons, tools, graves, ship remains, settlements, and imported goods show a world that included violence, trade, migration, family life, and cultural exchange. The written sources explain why the raids felt so frightening. The physical evidence shows that the Norse presence in Europe became much broader than raiding alone. Both kinds of evidence are needed to understand the period. From small raids to larger campaigns. Early raids could be seasonal and relatively small. Crews arrived, searched for wealth, and returned north before winter. During the 9th century, some expeditions became larger and more organized. Fleets stayed abroad longer. Leaders gathered followers from several regions. Camps were established near rivers and towns. Staying through the winter changed everything. A force that remained in one place needed food, shelter, horses, information, and agreements with local communities. It could also return to the same targets or intervene in local politics. Raiding slowly blended into conquest and settlement. The change was not identical everywhere, but across Britain and parts of the Frankish world, rulers now faced opponents who might remain for years instead of disappearing after a few days. Silver and the portable economy. Silver became one of the great connecting materials of the Viking Age. It could appear as coins, jewelry, arm rings, or pieces cut and weighed for their metal value. Norse traders and raiders collected silver from Western Europe, the British Isles, and far to the east. Hoards buried in Scandinavia sometimes contain coins struck in places thousands of kilometers apart. Silver was useful because it was portable and could be measured. A traveler did not always need to care which king had placed his face on a coin if the metal itself was trusted. This helped create an economy that crossed political borders. The same networks that moved silver also carried ideas, fashions, technologies, and stories between distant communities. Captives and enslavement. The Viking world also depended on slavery, a fact that should not be softened or ignored. Raids could take captives as well as goods. Enslaved people, often called thralls in Norse society, worked in households, farms, and other forms of labor. Some were sold through trading centers that linked Northern Europe to wider markets. Their experiences are difficult to reconstruct because they rarely controlled the written record. Archaeology and law codes provide only partial views. Enslavement was not unique to Scandinavia, but Viking raiding helped move people across long distances against their will. Behind the movement of silver and ships were human lives changed permanently by capture, sale, separation, and forced labor. Dublin and the Irish Sea. Ireland became one of the most important regions in the Viking story. Raids began in the late 8th century, but by the 9th century Norse groups established long-term bases. One settlement grew at Dublin, positioned near the River Liffey and the Irish Sea. It became a center for trade, craft, politics, and warfare. Norse rulers in Dublin interacted with Irish kingdoms through conflict, alliances, marriage, and commerce. The Irish Sea connected Dublin with Western Britain, the Isle of Man, and routes leading farther north and south. Over generations, communities mixed. The result was not a simple replacement of one population by another. It was a new political and commercial landscape shaped by both Norse and local traditions. The Great Heathen Army. In 865, a large Viking force arrived in England, remembered in English sources as the Great Heathen Army. It differed from earlier hit-and-run attacks because it campaigned for years and moved between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The force captured York in 866 and fought across Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. Its exact size is debated, and the word army can suggest numbers that the evidence cannot prove. What matters is its staying power. Leaders could divide forces, negotiate, take tribute, seize land, and return to strategic centers. For English rulers, the challenge was no longer simply protecting the coast. They now had to defend territory against mobile armies that could remain in the country through several seasons. The Danelaw. By the later 9th century, Scandinavian control and settlement had reshaped large parts of England. Historians use the term Danelaw for regions where Danish law and influence became especially strong, although the boundaries and institutions changed over time. Norse settlers did not arrive in an empty landscape. They lived among existing English communities, used old roads and fields, and adapted local systems. Place names ending in forms such as by and thorpe still preserve traces of Scandinavian settlement in parts of England. Language also mixed. Everyday words passed between Old Norse and Old English speakers who needed to work, trade, argue, marry, and govern beside one another. Political conquest gradually became ordinary local life. Jorvik, the Viking York. York, known to the Norse as Jorvik, became one of the great urban centers of Viking Age England. Its location linked river routes, roads, and fertile countryside. Archaeological excavations have revealed workshops, houses, tools, combs, shoes, textiles, and imported goods. These finds make the city feel less like a battlefield and more like a busy neighborhood. Craftspeople worked bone, antler, leather, metal, and wood. Merchants connected York to the North Sea and beyond. Rulers changed and violence remained part of politics, but daily life continued around those struggles. Jorvik shows how quickly an invading force could become part of an urban society, creating a community that was Scandinavian, English, and increasingly a mixture of both. Alfred and the defense of Wessex. One English kingdom resisted long enough to reorganize. Wessex, ruled by Alfred the Great from 871, survived repeated Viking pressure. Alfred is often remembered as a heroic defender, but his success depended on administration as much as battlefield courage. He negotiated when necessary, gathered resources, and strengthened systems that allowed armies to respond more reliably. The famous agreement with the Viking leader Guthrum followed years of conflict and helped define new political realities in England. Guthrum accepted Christianity and ruled in East Anglia. Alfred did not end the Viking presence. Instead, he created conditions that helped Wessex survive beside it, setting the stage for later English rulers to expand their authority. Buzz, roads, and readiness. A major part of Alfred's response was a network of fortified places known as Buzz. These strongpoints gave people and supplies protected locations and made it harder for raiders to move freely through the countryside. Roads and military obligations connected them to a wider defensive system. Alfred also supported naval forces, although the idea that he simply invented the English Navy is too neat. The deeper change was organization. Defense became less dependent on gathering a temporary army after danger appeared. It became something planned in advance. Later rulers developed these systems further. Viking pressure, therefore, encouraged new forms of taxation, fortification, administration, and royal authority. The attackers changed England partly because English rulers learned to answer them. Rollo and Normandy. Across the Channel, Frankish rulers faced similar problems along the Seine and other rivers. Viking groups raided towns, monasteries, and estates, sometimes returning repeatedly. In the early 10th century, the Frankish King Charles the Simple reached an agreement with the Scandinavian leader Rollo. Tradition connects this settlement with the year 911. Rollo and his followers received land around the Lower Seine in exchange for loyalty and defense. Their territory became the foundation of Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The newcomers adopted the local French language and Christianity over generations, while developing a strong regional identity. A group once known for raiding France became part of the political structure of France, guarding the same river approaches they had once used. How the Franks adapted. The Frankish response to Viking raids varied from battle to negotiation. Kings paid tribute at times, fortified bridges, strengthened towns, and tried to control important river crossings. Local nobles also built defenses and gathered their own forces. Political division inside the Frankish kingdom sometimes made resistance difficult because Viking leaders could take advantage of rivalries. Yet repeated attacks also encouraged local military power and stronger regional lordship. The story is important because Viking success was never based only on superior fighting. It often depended on choosing moments when opponents were divided, moving rapidly by water, and negotiating when negotiation was more profitable than battle. European rulers gradually learned the same flexible approach, mixing force, payment, diplomacy, and settlement. Paris on the Seine. Paris became a famous target because the Seine offered a route deep into the Frankish realm. Viking fleets attacked the city more than once. The Great Siege of 885 and 886 lasted many months and involved a large Scandinavian force. Paris was better defended than the monasteries of the early raids. Bridges and fortifications restricted movement along the river, and defenders held out despite severe pressure. The episode showed how the balance had changed. Viking armies could mount long campaigns, but European towns could also become difficult obstacles. The final settlement involved payment and political compromise rather than a simple victory. The river that had once made inland targets accessible could also become a defensive line when rulers learned how to control it. East across the Baltic. While some Norse sailors moved west, others traveled east across the Baltic. Swedish traders and warriors followed rivers through what are now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. These routes connected the Baltic with the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Travel required changing boats, crossing portages, negotiating with local communities, and surviving difficult river conditions. Scandinavian travelers entered a world already filled with Slavic, Baltic, Finnic, Turkic, and other peoples. They did not create these trade systems from nothing. They joined and expanded existing networks. The Eastern journeys remind us that the Viking Age was never only a story about Britain and France. Northern Europe was connected to some of the richest markets of Eurasia. The Rus. Sources from several traditions describe people called the Rus, a name connected in complex ways with Scandinavian elites and the societies of Eastern Europe. Norse-speaking traders and warriors were present at places such as Staraya Ladiga and Novgorod, and they became involved in political centers farther south. Over time, Scandinavian newcomers mixed with Slavic and other local populations. The early polity known as Kievan Rus developed from this multilingual and multi-ethnic environment. Debates about exactly how much influence Scandinavians had have lasted for generations, sometimes becoming tied to modern politics. Archaeology offers the clearest approach. Scandinavian-style objects appear beside local material, showing contact and integration rather than a simple story of outsiders ruling an unchanged population. Constantinople and the Varangians. Farther south stood Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the largest cities of the medieval world. Scandinavian travelers reached it through eastern river routes and knew it by names that emphasized its greatness. Trade brought northern visitors into contact with Byzantine wealth, religion, art, and administration. From the late 10th century onward, warriors from Scandinavia and the Rus became famous in Byzantine service as part of the Varangian Guard. For a young man from the north, service far from home could bring pay, prestige, and stories worth carrying back. Objects and coins found in Scandinavia show how distant the connections became. The Viking world reached well beyond the shores usually shown on maps of Western Europe. Silver from the Islamic world. One of the clearest signs of Eastern trade is the large number of Islamic silver coins, known as dirhams, found in Scandinavia and around the Baltic. Many were minted in regions far from Northern Europe. They traveled through chains of merchants rather than one continuous voyage by a single Viking crew. Furs, wax, amber, enslaved people, and other goods moved south and east, while silver moved back toward the Baltic. Coins were sometimes cut into pieces and valued by weight. A dirham found in a Swedish hoard, therefore, tells a story much larger than the coin itself. It shows how Scandinavian communities participated in exchange systems stretching toward the cities and markets of the Islamic world. Hedeby, Birka, and Koppang. Trade needed places where people could meet. Viking Age Scandinavia developed busy settlements such as Hedeby, Birka, and Koppang. These were not modern cities, but they concentrated merchants, craftspeople, ships, workshops, and imported goods. Hedeby sat near the base of the Jutland Peninsula, where travelers could move goods between the North Sea and Baltic without sailing the long way around Denmark. Birka connected Sweden with Baltic routes. Koppang served networks along the Norwegian coast. At such places, a visitor might hear several languages and see objects from distant regions. Their existence shows that the Viking Age was also an age of urban growth. Trade created permanent communities where seasonal voyages met settled craft and administration. What the traders carried. Viking Age merchants dealt in practical and valuable goods. Northern forests supplied furs. Coastal communities produced fish and marine products. Craftspeople exchanged metalwork, glass beads, combs, textiles, and tools. Amber from the Baltic traveled widely. Wine, pottery, silver, silk, and other luxury goods arrived from distant markets. People were also bought and sold, linking trade to the institution of slavery. Cargo ships were broader and deeper than fast warships because carrying capacity mattered more than speed. These commercial voyages rarely appear in dramatic stories, yet they may have been more common than battles. A reliable trader could create relationships that lasted for years, carrying information as carefully as cargo and making distant ports familiar to one another. Hands that made the Viking world. Every voyage depended on skilled work at home. Shipwrights selected timber and shaped planks. Smiths forged tools, nails, knives, and weapons. Carpenters built houses, chests, and equipment. Textile production consumed enormous labor because sails required large quantities of wool and careful weaving. Leather workers made shoes and straps. Bone and antler became combs, handles, and small objects. These crafts were learned through practice rather than written manuals. A finished longship, therefore, represented the knowledge of many people who might never join a raid. When archaeologists recover worn tools or unfinished objects, they reveal this quieter foundation of expansion. The Viking Age moved on ships, but those ships existed because households and specialists spent countless hours making them usable. Women, households, and property. Women played central roles in Viking Age households and could hold significant social and economic responsibility, although rights varied by place, status, and period. Norse law and later written sources suggest that some women could own property, inherit under certain conditions, manage farms, and seek divorce. Archaeology also shows women traveling far from Scandinavia, sometimes as part of settlement communities. This matters because permanent migration required more than groups of warriors. Farms in Iceland, communities in the British Isles, and settlements elsewhere needed families, labor, and continuity between generations. Wealthy women could be buried with fine objects, while ordinary women left fewer visible traces. Their work in textiles, food production, management, and exchange was essential to the society behind every voyage. Gods of the Old North. Before Christianity became dominant, Norse religion included many gods, local practices, sacred places, and stories. Odin was associated with knowledge, poetry, kingship, and war. Thor was linked with protection and strength. Freyr and Freya were connected with fertility, prosperity, and other aspects of life. Yet belief was not organized through one central church or a single written doctrine. Ritual could happen at farms, halls, natural places, and larger gatherings. Much of what we know was written down after conversion, especially in medieval Iceland, so historians compare literature with archaeology and place names. The old religion was lived differently across regions. It was a flexible collection of traditions rather than one perfectly uniform system. Runes and remembering. Runes gave Scandinavian communities a way to write names, messages, ownership marks, memorials, and short statements. The Viking Age used a runic alphabet, often called the Younger Futhark. Many surviving inscriptions are brief, but runestones could be public monuments. A family might raise a stone in memory of someone who died abroad, naming journeys to England, the East, or other regions. These inscriptions bring individual voices closer than broad political histories can. They mention parents, children, partners, companions, bridges, property, and travel. Runes were not mysterious magical symbols in every context. They were also practical writing. A carved line on stone could preserve a person's name for 1,000 years, making memory part of the landscape. Burials and what they tell us. Viking Age burials varied widely. Some people were cremated, others buried intact. Graves could contain tools, jewelry, weapons, animals, vehicles, or boats, but many were much simpler. The objects placed with the dead reflected ritual choices and social identity, not a complete inventory of a person's life. Famous ship burials such as Oseberg and Gokstad belonged to elites and should not be treated as ordinary examples. Modern archaeology studies bones, soil, textiles, plant remains, and microscopic evidence alongside spectacular objects. This work has changed older assumptions about gender, diet, movement, and status. A grave is not a direct photograph of Viking society, but thousands of graves together reveal patterns that written sources often miss. Iceland. During the late 9th century, settlers from Norway and communities around the British Isles began establishing farms in Iceland. The island had no large indigenous population, though Irish monks may have visited earlier. Settlement required careful choices about land, animals, timber, and winter supplies. Archaeology and later Icelandic texts preserve memories of the process, although sagas were written long after the first settlers. Genetic evidence also reflects mixed origins, with significant ancestry from both Scandinavia and the British Isles. Iceland became a society at the edge of the North Atlantic, connected by ships to Norway and beyond. Distance did not create isolation. Imported goods, travelers, law, religion, and news continued to cross the sea. The Althing. Around the year 930, Icelanders established the Althing, a general assembly where legal and political business could be conducted. It met at Thingvellir, a landscape of open ground and dramatic geology. The Althing was not a modern parliament with equal voting rights. Power remained concentrated among chieftains and influential families. Yet it provided a shared place for law, dispute settlement, alliances, announcements, and social gathering. In a society without a king, law depended heavily on memory, public procedure, and networks of support. The assembly shows another side of Norse political culture. The same people remembered for raiding also invested great effort in legal rules, negotiation, compensation, and formal ways to manage conflict. Greenland. Late in the 10th century, Norse settlers pushed farther west. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland after conflict, explored Greenland and later encouraged settlement there. Around the 980s, communities were established in the southwest, especially in what became known as the Eastern and Western settlements. The name Greenland may have helped make the new land sound attractive, but parts of the coast did support grazing during the medieval warm period. Settlers raised livestock, hunted, built churches, and maintained contact with Iceland and Norway. Life remained demanding. Timber was limited, sea travel was essential, and farming existed near environmental limits. Still, Norse Greenland survived for centuries, far longer than a temporary expedition. West to Vinland. From Greenland, Norse sailors reached lands farther west around the year 1000. Later Icelandic sagas describe voyages associated with Leif Erikson and places called Helgeland, Markland, and Vinland. The strongest archaeological evidence comes from Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland, where remains of Norse-style buildings and ironworking show a European presence around this period. The site was not a large colony. It was a small base, probably used for exploration and repair. Its discovery changed the history of transatlantic contact by proving that Norse travelers reached North America centuries before Columbus. The achievement was remarkable, but it did not create a lasting European settlement on the continent at that time. Why Vinland did not become a colony? The Norse had the ships to reach North America, but regular settlement required more than navigation. Greenland itself had a small population and limited resources. A new colony farther west would depend on long supply lines across dangerous seas. The sagas also describe conflict with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrælingr, although the texts were written much later and must be read carefully. Local peoples already knew the land far better than the visitors did. The advantages that helped Vikings raid European coasts did not guarantee success in a distant environment. Exploration could be repeated, but a stable colony needed families, food, trade, security, and continuous support. Those conditions never came together on a large scale. The slow conversion to Christianity. Christianity entered Scandinavia gradually through merchants, captives, missionaries, royal courts, and neighboring societies. Conversion was not one moment when everyone abandoned older beliefs. For generations, Christian symbols and traditional practices could exist side by side. Kings often supported the new religion because it connected them with powerful European institutions and ideas of sacred monarchy. Churches also created new networks of literacy and administration. Resistance occurred, especially when conversion became tied to royal authority and taxation. By the 11th century, Christianity had become established across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, though the pace varied. The change linked Scandinavia more closely to Latin Christian Europe and transformed burial, law, art, writing, and political life. Kings grow stronger. The Viking Age began in a Scandinavia divided among many local rulers. By its later centuries, larger kingdoms were taking clearer shape. This process was uneven and often violent, but overseas wealth and warfare could help ambitious leaders build followings. Control of trading towns, ports, tribute, and military fleets gave rulers resources that smaller chiefs lacked. Christianity offered another form of support by linking kings with bishops, churches, written administration, and European royal models. At the same time, local assemblies and aristocratic families remained important. State formation was therefore a negotiation between older regional power and newer royal institutions. The Viking Age helped create the wealth and connections that made stronger Scandinavian monarchies possible. Harald Bluetooth in Denmark. Denmark provides one of the clearest examples of royal consolidation. Harald Bluetooth ruled in the second half of the 10th century and is associated with major building projects, fortifications, and the conversion of Denmark to Christianity. The Great Jelling Stone famously states that Harald won Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Like many royal inscriptions, it presents an idealized claim, but it shows how the king wanted his authority remembered. Ring fortresses and other large works suggest an ability to organize labor on a scale greater than most earlier rulers. Denmark's location between the Baltic and North Sea also made control of routes especially valuable. Royal power grew alongside the same networks that had supported Viking travel. Norway and the long coast. Norway's geography made political unification difficult. Long distances, mountains, and fjords supported strong local communities and regional leaders. Later sagas connect Harald Faireyr with an early unification, but the details were written centuries afterward and cannot be accepted literally. What is clearer is that during the 10th and 11th centuries, rulers competed to control coastal routes, royal estates, trade, and tribute. Some spent years abroad before returning with wealth and followers. Christianity became part of these struggles. Kings such as Olaf and work with the church. Still, his reign shows how closely connected Scandinavia and England had become. A dynasty that grew from Viking conquest could now present itself as a legitimate Christian monarchy within European politics. Stamford Bridge, 1066. The year 1066 is often used as a convenient endpoint for the Viking Age in England. In September, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada invaded with a large fleet and allied with Tostig Godwinson. They defeated an English force near York, but King Harald Godwinson marched north with surprising speed. At Stamford Bridge, the English army defeated the invaders, and Harald Hardrada was killed. The victory ended a major Norwegian attempt to take the English throne. Yet it did not end Scandinavian travel or influence. Ships still crossed the North Sea, merchants still traded, and Scandinavian kingdoms remained active in European politics. What ended was a particular era in which large independent Viking armies repeatedly sought territory in England. From Vikings to Normans. Only weeks after Stamford Bridge, England faced another invasion from across the Channel. William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harald Godwinson at Hastings and became king. The Normans were French-speaking Christians by 1066, but their duchy had grown from Scandinavian settlement under Rollo and his successors. In that sense, one legacy of the Viking Age returned to England in a new form. Norman rule changed landholding, castles, government, and elite culture. It also demonstrates how quickly identities could transform. Descendants of Norse settlers no longer thought of themselves simply as Vikings. Within generations, they had become Normans, carrying a mixture of Scandinavian ancestry, French language, Christian institutions, and their own political ambitions across Europe. Words that remained. The Viking presence can still be heard in the English language. Contact between Old Norse and Old English brought many ordinary words into use, especially in areas of Scandinavian settlement. Words such as sky, egg, window, take, and they have Norse roots or were strongly influenced by Norse speech. Place names preserve another layer of memory. Endings such as by, meaning a farm or settlement, appear across parts of northern and eastern England. These traces survived because people lived together for generations. Language changed through conversations in homes, markets, fields, and legal gatherings, not through a single official decision. The quiet persistence of words may be one of the most intimate legacies of the Viking Age. Towns, trade, and new political maps. Viking activity helped reshape European towns and trade routes. Some settlements, including Dublin and York, grew under strong Scandinavian influence. Other towns strengthened defenses because of repeated attacks. Kings developed systems for taxation, military service, and fortification. River crossings and ports gained new strategic importance. Across the Baltic, trading centers linked Northern Europe to Eastern markets. None of these changes can be credited to Vikings alone. European societies were already evolving for many reasons. Yet, Norse mobility increased the speed and intensity of contact. Raiding forced responses. Settlement created mixed communities. Trade moved silver and goods over long distances. By the 11th century, the political and commercial map of Northern Europe looked very different from the one known 2 centuries earlier. The Viking of modern imagination. Modern culture often turns the Viking into a single recognizable character, a huge warrior in a horned helmet. Real Viking Age helmets did not have the famous theatrical horns. Nor were all Scandinavians raiders, or all raiders permanently at war. Archaeology reveals farmers, merchants, craftspeople, migrants, enslaved people, sailors, rulers, and families. The period also varied greatly from Denmark to Iceland, from Dublin to the river routes of the East. Reenactments can help us imagine clothing, movement, ships, and tools, but they remain modern reconstructions. The closer we look at the evidence, the less simple the Viking becomes. That complexity makes the history more interesting because it replaces a costume with a society. A sea that connected Europe. By the middle of the 11th century, the conditions that created the Viking Age had changed. Scandinavian kingdoms were stronger, Christianity was established, and rulers increasingly acted within the political systems of medieval Europe. Raiding did not vanish overnight, and long-distance sailing certainly did not end. What changed was the identity and organization of the people making those journeys. The sea routes remained. So did the towns, words, families, laws, and memories created by centuries of movement. From a quiet Scandinavian shore, ships had reached Britain, Ireland, France, the Baltic, Byzantium, Iceland, Greenland, and North America. The Viking Age changed Europe because travel created contact, and contact left traces long after the sails disappeared from the horizon.